Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Mem Chet, New Mishnah. Shalosh Asherot Hen. There are three categories of prohibited idolatrous trees. Ilan shenetom techila l'shem avodah zara harezo asura. If one planted a tree to begin with in order to worship it as idolatry, then the entire tree is prohibited. Here's a picture of an idolatrous tree in India. So you see that there are places that people are still worshiping trees. If someone does plant a tree like this, the only way for it to become permitted is if a non-Jew nullifies it by damaging the tree, thereby showing that he is not treating it like an idol anymore. But otherwise, the entire tree is prohibited from getting any benefit from. However, if someone had a regular tree, it was planted as a permitted tree, and then someone came and cut off a piece of the trunk or cut off a branch. Basically, he pruned it. By pruning it, that will prompt further growth. And he pruned it so that the new growth will be idolatrous. So he doesn't want the trunk, the main part of the tree that's already there, to become prohibited. Only the new growth that will result from this pruning. And it did regrow. In order for it to become permitted, he has to remove the new growth. The old part of the tree itself remains permitted, only the new growth is prohibited, and if he cuts off the new growth, then everything is okay. If he placed an idol under the tree, and then only temporarily, and then took it away, the tree remains permitted. If he would put an idol under the tree permanently, then the tree is an accessory to Avodah Zara. But if he puts it there only temporarily and then removes it, then the tree remains permitted. Amri deber biyanai, vehu shehibrich v'hirkib begufo shel ilan. Those from the school of Rabbi Yanai commented on the second clause in the Mishnah that talks about the new growth, and they said, when does the new growth become prohibited? Only if someone sank a shoot of the vine or grafted. Sinking a shoot means that one takes a branch, a long branch, and bends it down into under the ground, and then that eventually grows an entirely new tree. So that's a major act that's making something, it's connected to and it's from the old tree, but it's going to end up being a totally new tree. So that's a major act, and that new tree, if it's done for Avodah Zarah, will become prohibited. Or if one grafts, you take a piece of another tree, graft it onto a branch of this tree, and then the new growth from that, if you had in mind when grafting that the new growth would be for idolatry, then the new growth is prohibited. Now, this would seem to mean that if one did not do either of these major acts of sinking or grafting, but you just pruned, then the whatever grew after pruning would be permitted, because that's a small act. Only a big act like this would make the new growth prohibited. So this seems to contradict the Mishnah. And so we ask, our Mishnah said, if you cut off a piece of the trunk or trim some of the branches, then the new growth is prohibited. And so all the more so, a major act, but Rabbi Yanai says only a big act of sinking or grafting makes the new growth prohibited, but it sounds like if you just pruned, then the new growth would be permitted. Okay, so we have to reinterpret Rabbi Yanai. He's not talking about the second clause, the part of it that explains to us when a new growth becomes prohibited, but rather he wants to tell us about how it becomes permitted, that how do you nullify something? That's what he's teaching us. That even if a person sank a new shoot or grafted onto a tree and then the new growth is prohibited, as long as he cuts off the new growth, then the rest of the tree is permitted. Because I might have thought that if I would sink a shoot or graft in the major part of the tree itself. So I might think that this is as if I planted the tree to begin with as idolatry, and maybe the whole tree would become prohibited, and then just by cutting off the new growth would not be sufficient. I would have to do a major nullification by a non-Jew, and so therefore the Biyanai comes to teach us not so. So in summary, basically the Biyanai is saying that a tree does become prohibited by no matter in many ways. It could be by grafting, or by sinking a new shoot, or even by pruning. The new growth in all those cases will be prohibited. That is obvious. What the Chidush that is teaching us is that in order for the tree to remain permitted, and if you want everything to be permitted, all you have to do is cut off the new growth, and that applies to the simple case of pruning, the new growth, just cut it off, and even to the more complex cases, the more major effort that one did to sink a shoot or to graft, where you might think that the whole tree becomes prohibited. No, just cut off whatever new growth there is, and then the rest of the tree will be permitted. Amar Shemuel, Hamishtachave le'ilan tosafte asura. Now Shemuel has a law, and we're going to ask because it seems to contradict the Mishnah. He says if someone bows down to a tree, the new growth is prohibited. Now we're talking about a tree that was planted as a permitted tree. If it was planted as an idolatrous tree, then certainly the whole thing would be prohibited. So we're talking about a regular tree, one bows down to it, and Shemuel is saying that even the new growth becomes prohibited. You might think, oh, this is new growth. It came after I bow down to it. So Shemuel is saying it's prohibited. Matib Rabbi Elazar. Gideo fiselo Avoda Zara vechelif. Notel ma shechlif. Gideo fiselo in. Lo gideo fiselo la. Rabbi Elazar challenges Shemuel from our Mishnah. Because from our Mishnah, it sounds like only if you do a significant act of cutting or trimming, pruning the tree for the sake of Avodah Zarah, then the new growth, and it grows a new branch, then that new growth will be prohibited, and you have to cut off that new branch. Sounds like only if you trimmed or pruned, then the new growth becomes prohibited. But if you did not do that physical act, but only bow down to the tree, then the new growth would be permitted. But Shemuel said that the new growth is prohibited even for just bowing down to it. So how could Shemuel explain the Mishnah? Amar lach Shemuel hamane Rabbanan hi. Ushmuel damar kerebi Yosef bar Yehuda damar ilan shenetaol basof abado asur. Shemuel can explain that the Mishnah is following the opinion of Rabbanan. Rabbanan, remember, we saw this machloket a few times. Rabbanan say that only if a tree is planted as an Avodah Zarah tree, then the whole tree is prohibited. But if it's planted as a permitted tree, and then someone bows down to it, it doesn't become prohibited for regular use, only for gavoa, but it remains permitted. You can't make a tree which is connected to the ground and therefore part of the ground, you can't make it prohibited just by bowing down to it. And that's why the Mishnah fits with Rabbanan. Just bowing down to it, a tree that's permitted, doesn't do anything. Only if you do an act on the tree by pruning it, then the new growth will be prohibited. But Shemuel, he follows the opinion of Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, who says that even a tree that was planted in a permitted way, and then in the end someone bowed down to it, the whole tree becomes prohibited, the tree itself, and the new growths also are prohibited. And so therefore there's no contradiction. Shemuel's following the different opinion of Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, the Mishnah's opinion of Rabbanan. But Kifla Rav Asher, Rav Asher challenges this answer. How do you know that Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda and Rabbanan would argue on the new growths? Maybe everybody would agree that the new growths are prohibited, even Rabbanan. Before we were assuming that Rabbanan would say when you bow down to a regular tree, then it's all permitted. But maybe not. Maybe even Rabbanan would agree that you have a tree, it's a permitted tree, it was planted as a permitted tree. If someone bows down to it, yes, the tree remains permitted, that's what he said all along, but maybe the new growths from now on, now that you bow down to it, whatever is there now is okay, but the new growths, after you bow down to it, will be prohibited. And Rabbanan and Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda would agree with that. So everybody would agree that the new growths are prohibited, and the machloket is only regarding the remaining, the old part of the tree that was already there. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda sabar ikaronami asur dichtib va'asherehem tisrifun ba'esh. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda is stringent, and he says that the trunk, the tree, the whole part of all of the tree that's already there, also becomes prohibited when someone bows down to it. And we know that from this plural that says, Asherehem, there. Asherah, trees, one must burn with fire. So that's coming to include multiple cases, both the case when the tree is planted in the first place as Avoda Zara, and also a case where one bows down to a regular tree. The whole thing becomes prohibited. V'Rabbanan sabre ikar ilan share dichtib va'asherehem tegadeun ezehu ilan shegidu o asur ve'ikaro share have omer ilan shenetaol basof abado. And the rabbis will say, if you have a tree that was planted as a permitted tree and then someone bowed down to it afterwards, the main part of the tree that already was there is permitted, and only the new growths are going to be prohibited. And his source will be a different pasuk from Devarim 7 that says, Asherahem tegadeon, you have to cut down the tree. Now when you say cut down, it means that there's something new part, that there's some part that you have to cut down that's prohibited, and there is some part that is okay, that you don't have to cut down, because tegadeon just means cut down, not uproot totally. So what is a tree where a hewn part is prohibited, then you have to cut that off, but the rest of it, the trunk, is permitted? This is a tree that you planted as a permitted tree and then you worshipped it afterwards. So Rabbanan would say only the new growths from then on are prohibited, but whatever is there from the tree from beforehand is permitted. And so we see that both opinions, they have different sources that they can learn their opinions from, but what they have in common is that the new growths are prohibited according to everyone. And so according to that, both opinions, both Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda and Rabbanan would be in accordance with Shemuel, who says that new growths are all prohibited, even if you did not do any pruning. We'll ask in a second who the Mishnah is following if we say that everybody agrees that the new growths are prohibited even without pruning. But first we want to clarify something else. And if you should challenge Rav Asher's explanation here based on what we said earlier on Daf 45b, over there we brought both of these Pesukim, but in the opposite direction. It was actually Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda who cited Va'asherehem tegadeon, that you have to cut it down, with the same derasha, that there is a tree that the part that you cut down is prohibited and the base is permitted. And he said, what is such a tree? That's one that was planted as a permitted tree and then one worshipped it. And according to his understanding, the entire tree that's above ground is prohibited, but the roots that are underground are permitted. You don't have to uproot those roots because it was planted as a permitted tree. You just have to take off everything that is above ground. And so is Rabbi Yosef that quoted Va'asherem tegadeon, and Rabbanan quoted the other pasuk Va'asherehem tisrefun ba'esh. And now you're telling me that it's Rabbanan that quote Va'asherem tegadeon, and therefore the tree itself, the whole trunk and the old part of the tree before it was worshipped is permitted, but the new growths are prohibited, even according to Rabbanan. So if you're going to challenge me because we quoted the Pesukim in the opposite way before, well, that's no problem for Rav Asher. Puch Rabbanan le Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, or Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda le Rabbanan. So we'll just switch them around, and it's okay, just like we did here. And we'll say that Rabbanan are the one that quote Va'asherem tegadeon, Rabbi Yosef is the one that quoted Va'asherem tisrefun ba'esh. As long as each one has a pasuk, it doesn't really matter which one is which. So just because we said the opposite before, okay, we'll switch them around to fit with Rav Asher's interpretation. Okay, so that's no problem. Im ken, but here, now we do have a problem. Gideo fiselo man katani la. Who would be the author of our Mishnah that says that only if you prune a tree for the sake of Avoda Zara, that the new growth will be idolatrous, only then does it become prohibited, because you're doing an action on the tree. But if you only worship the tree and didn't do any action, then it sounds like from the Mishnah it would be permitted. Who would be the author of the Mishnah? Lo Rabbanan velo Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. I Rabbanan velo Gideo fiselo name tosefet asura. I Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda ikar ilan name asur. It can't be Rabbanan, it can't be Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. If it's Rabbanan, if you did not prune the tree, then the new growth, even if you did not prune the tree, the new growth would still be prohibited. That's how Rav Ashi explained Rabbanan. And if the Mishnah is Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, that can't be either, because he says the entire tree becomes prohibited once you bow down to it. Even if it was planted as a permitted tree, we bow down to it. The old part and the new part are all prohibited. So none of these opinions say that only if you prune it is the new growth prohibited. These opinions all say that even if you just bow down to it, the new growth is prohibited. So who is going to be the author of our Mishnah? And the answer is actually could be anyone. I ba'etema Rabbanan, I ba'etema Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. We can explain the Mishnah according to Rabbanan, and we can even explain the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. How so? I ba'etema Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, ki kama Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda belo gideo fiselo, ikad ilan asur bistama. Aval gideo ufiselo gale adate de betosefet nichale bikarilan la nichale. We can explain the Mishnah according to the Yosef bar Yehuda. And when the Yosef bar Yehuda says that even without doing any pruning, the entire tree becomes prohibited, yes, that's true. If one simply bow down to it without specification, just bows down to the tree, then the whole tree, the old part and the new part become prohibited. That's true. But if someone goes and prunes the tree with intention that the new growth specifically only will become prohibited, so there he thereby reveals his intention that he only wants the new growth to be prohibited, but the main part of the tree he does not want to become prohibited. He's not treating the old part of the tree as idolatrous, only the new part. So, kind of paradoxically, by doing an act, which we thought was, doing an act is more stringent, is going to be worse. Actually not true. By doing an act to a specific part of the tree and cutting off this particular branch, he's showing he only wants the new growth of this branch over here to be prohibited, but not the rest of the tree. Whereas, if he just bows down to the whole tree without any specification, then the entire tree, old and new, become prohibited. So we can reconcile the Mishnah with Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. Iba'etema Rabbanan, gideo fiselo isteri chale, sakada tachamina kevan da'abad le ma'aseh begufe, ikad ilan name litasar kamashmalan. I can explain the Mishnah according to Rabbanan, and that which you asked, well, sounds like from the Mishnah, since it says when you prune it, then the new growths are prohibited, but if you didn't prune it, only bow down to it without an act, then it should be permitted. That was the question. But we can say not so. In fact, the Mishnah is in agreement with Rabbanan, and it doesn't matter whether you bow down to the whole tree or do an act and prune it. The new growth is prohibited in either way. So you'll say, well, why does the Mishnah mention the pruning if even just not pruning and bowing down to it makes the new growth prohibited? And the answer is no, I need to say when you prune it, the new growth is prohibited, because I might have thought that since I did an act on the tree, a physical act on the tree, by pruning it, that the entire tree will become prohibited, according to Rabbanan. In other words, I might have thought, according to Rabbanan, if I bow down to the tree from afar, then only the new growth is prohibited. But if I go and I cut a branch of the tree, then, since I'm doing an act, maybe, according to Rabbanan, the whole tree becomes prohibited. I might have thought that. And that's why the Mishnah says specifically that if I prune the tree, then only the new growth is prohibited, not the whole tree. And for sure, if I just bow down to the tree and not touch it, then also only the new growth is prohibited and not the whole tree. Next Mishnah. Ezo Asherah. What is an Asherah tree? Kol sheyesh tachteha avoda zara. Rabbi Shimon omer kol sheovdim otam. So how do you know if something is an Asherah tree? Well, according to Tanakama, if there is an idol beneath it. The tree is used to give shade, to give protection to an idol, then the tree is prohibited as an Asherah tree. Rabbi Shimon, however, says no, only if they worship the tree itself. Just because it's giving shade to an idol, that's not sufficient to make the tree itself idolatry, only if the tree itself is worshipped. ומסעו תחתיו גל. אמר להן רבי שמעון, בדקו את הגל הזה, ובדקוהו ומסעו בו סורה. אמר להן, הואיל ולסורה הן עובדין, נתיר להן et ha'ilan. And there was a story in Sidon that there was a tree that idolaters were worshiping the tree. And they wanted to try to permit the tree. And now they saw that there was a mound of stones beneath the tree. It just looked like a pile of dirt. It didn't look like anything. So people thought that everybody's worshiping the tree, and therefore the tree is prohibited. But Rabbi Shimon said, go check that mound of stones. See if there's anything under it. And they in fact checked, and it turns out there was an idol beneath the stones. And so he said, since there's an idol under there, that means when they were bowing down to the idol. And the tree was only giving protection to it, and therefore the tree, according to Rabbi Shimon, is permitted. We ask, Ezu Asherah v'hanan shalosh asherotenan. Why is this Mishnah asking, what is an Asherah? We already had in the previous Mishnah, it says that there are 3 categories of Asherah. So we learned all about the categories of Asherah trees. So why are you asking now in the next Mishnah, what is an Asherah tree? Hachi ka'amar, shetaim ledibreha kol v'achat machloket Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. This is the proper way to understand the flow of the Mishnayot. The previous Mishnah indeed said that there are 3 categories of Asherah trees. And now when it says Ezo Asherah, it's saying 2 of the 3 categories above everybody agrees with. That's the first 2 categories. If one planted a tree to begin with as an idolatrous tree, everybody agrees prohibited. And also, if one prunes a tree so that the new growth will be prohibited, everybody also agrees that that the new growths over there are prohibited. But the third category is subject to a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan. And so that's what this Mishnah is asking. And so it says, Ezo hi asherah shenechleku ba Rabbi Shimon v'chachamim kol sheyesh tachteh avoda zara. Rabbi Shimon omer kol sheovdim ota. And what is an Asherah tree? Of the third category, about which there is a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Chachamim, that is a tree that has an idol under it. Rabbi Shimon says that the tree itself is permitted unless you actually worship the tree. In other words, category 1 and 2 are prohibited, but category 3 is totally permitted. Whereas according to Chachamim, it depends if it's temporary or permanent. If you put an idol under the tree temporarily and then removed it, then the tree remains permitted. But if you put an idol under the tree permanently, then Chachamim in our Mishnah explain, then that tree itself is also prohibited. Ezohi Asherah setam. Now, how do we know if something is an Asherah tree without knowing specifically that someone worshipped it or planted it for an Asherah tree? We don't know about that. We're just looking at the tree. We want some clues. Is this an Asherah tree? How would we know? Amarav kol shekumarim yoshvim tachteha ve'en tomim meperoteha. There's any time you see some idolatrous priests sitting under the tree and not tasting its fruits. Why would they not taste the fruits? Because it's an idolatrous tree, so the fruits are consecrated to the idol, so they're not going to eat them. Otherwise, usually if you're sitting under a tree, you see under a fruit tree, people are going to eat from the fruits. They get hungry, and there's fruit right there. If they're not eating from it, that's a sign that they're treating it like an idolatrous tree, even if you don't actually see them bowing down to it. ושמואל אמר אפילו אמריה נתמרה לבי נסרפה אסור תרמה בשכרה ושתה לה ביום אדם. Shmuel says, even if you hear people saying the dates of this tree should be for the house of this idol, nasrefe. Even if they just say that, the tree is forbidden because the idol worshippers take these dates and they put it into the beer and they drink it. And so even here, they're dedicating the fruit to idolatry. And so that even just hearing them say that is enough to make it prohibited. Amar Amemar Amaru li Sabeh de Pumbedita Hilcheta Kishmuel. Amemar says that the elders of Pumbedita says halacha is like Shemuel, that not only if you see them not eating it is it prohibited, but even if they just say, hey, let's dedicate these dates to this idol, that also makes the tree prohibited, and you assume that they worship it as an idolatrous tree. Next Mishnah, Lo yesheb besila ve'im yashab tahor ve'lo ya'bor tachteha ve'im avad tameh. Hayta gozelet et harabim ve'abar tachteha tahor. One is not permitted to sit under the shade of a tree. We have to define these terms. If you're sitting directly under the tree, right under the leaves, that is definitely prohibited, and one would become tameh. This is tum'ah midrabanan, for benefiting from the tree directly by sitting under its leaves. So we're not talking about that case. That would be obvious that you're not allowed, and in fact that person would be tameh. Rather, we're talking about sitting under the shade that is beyond, right under the leaves. If the sun is directly on top of the tree, then only that which is right under the leaves will get shade. But we're not talking about that case. Imagine if the sun is, let's say, at a 45-degree angle above the horizon compared to where the person is sitting, so that the tree's shade will fall beyond itself. If it would be at 45 degrees, then if the tree is 10 feet high, the shade will go 10 feet horizontally to the side of the tree, even though it's not directly under the tree. We're going to see in a moment that there is sometimes even shade beyond that. If the sun is lower down, then the shade will extend even beyond 10 feet. And that's called a secondary shade, or shade of a shade. So Gemara will discuss precisely which one it is, but the point is it's not talking about directly under the tree, but rather the shade that the tree casts beyond the leaves, beyond sitting directly under the leaves. So one is not permitted to sit in the shade of the tree. If he did sit, even though he violated this prohibition, nevertheless there's no ritual impurity. One is not permitted to walk under a tree. If he did walk under the tree, then he does become tameh. And this is talking about walking directly under the leaves of the tree. Now, if the tree overhangs and encroaches into the public domain, well, what are you supposed to do then? This is a public domain. It's a street. If someone passes under it, that person is tahor, even though he's going directly under the leaves of the tree, but it's a public domain. And so therefore, he does not become tameh. Lo yesheb besila pishita. Let's analyze the first statement that says one should not sit in the shade. Isn't that obvious that you can't sit in the shade? Are you benefiting from the tree? Amar Abba bar bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo nisracha ela lesel sila. Rabbi Yochanan explains that it's giving us a chidush. Not only can't you sit under the primary shade of the tree, even the secondary shade of the tree. So that, in other words, if the sun is, let's say, lower down in the horizon, so the primary shade would be if the height of the tree, if you make it horizontal, the tree is 10 feet high, so it's the primary shade is within 10 feet circumference around it, even though that's beyond where the leaves are. That's the primary. Secondary shade is beyond the 10 feet. So Rabbi Yochanan says that the Mishnah comes to teach, even in the secondary shade, there's a prohibition not to get any benefit from the shade of the tree and not to sit there. Now, should we derive from this that if someone sat in the primary shade within 10 feet, then they would become tameh? Because if you say that the opening clause is the secondary shade, so that's where you can't sit, and that's where you're tahor. But can we infer that if you're within 10 feet, then you become tameh? No, la tafilu lesel komata nameh im yashav tahor hakamashmalan tafilu lesel sila lo yesheb. No, that's not why we are specifying that case. And in fact, even if you sat in the primary shade and within the 10 feet, if you're not allowed to sit there, but if you sat there, also it would be tahor. And so why is the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, talking about a case of beyond the 10 feet? to say that even there in the secondary shade there's a prohibition. But there's no distinction in the law, the primary shade or secondary shade. In both of them, there's a prohibition to sit there, but there's no tum'ah if you do. Some apply the statement of Rabbi Yochanan to the continuation. V'im yashab tahor. That section that says if you sat there, then it's your tahor. Peshita, isn't that obvious? You're not sitting under the leaves themselves, so obviously you're tahor. Amar Abba bar Hana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Lo nisrachela lesel komata. Rabbi Yochanan. So no, there is a chidush that this is true only regarding the height of the shade of its height. In other words, the primary part of it. And so it's teaching us, even there, certainly if the secondary part, if you're sitting there, you're going to be tahor. But the Mishnah wants to teach that even the primary part of the shade also would be permitted. It would be tahor, not permitted, but tahor. Now, can we derive from this? Since the entire clause is talking about primary shade, so it's under primary shade, that's where you're not allowed to sit, but you're tahor if you do. That means secondary shade, maybe you can infer that you're allowed even to sit there, lechatechila. So can we infer that from this statement? No, this Mishnah is teaching us that even though one is sitting in the primary shade, nevertheless, if you sit there, you're not allowed to sit there, but if you do sit there, it's tahor. So according to this version also, there is no distinction between the primary and secondary. In both the primary and secondary, you're not allowed to sit there, but if you do sit there, one is tahor. It's just two different ways of applying. Rabbi Yochanan, was he emphasizing the first part of the clause or the second part of the clause? But in the end, the law will be the same in both parts. You can't sit, lechatechila, but if you do, b'diavad, then one is tahor. Now you're not allowed to walk under the tree, and if you did walk under the tree, one becomes tameh. Again, this is tumad dirabanan, to try to prevent people from doing this, and so that there's further consequences for violating this law. My tama, what is the reason? Because there's no way that there is not some remnant of a sacrifice of Avoda Zara under the tree. And so we want to make sure that a person is not in an ohel. So this is tum'ah by ohel, just like a dead body. If there's a dead body in a covering under the same roof as a person, so that tum'ah spreads throughout the whatever under the roof, and so too, it's not that walking under the shade by itself makes a person tameh, but rather it's because there is an idolatrous substance, some sacrifice that is under the tree. They're always making sacrifices there. There's got to be some animal part somewhere under there. Maneh, whose opinion is this? Rabbi Yehuda ben Betarahi detanya. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betara omer, Menaim l'tikra b'avodah zara shemetamea be'ohel. Baraita says, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betara, how do we know that a sacrifice to avodah zara spreads tum'ah even under in a tent, anywhere under a roof? Shenemar v'yisamedu lebal peror v'yichlu zibche metim. Ma met metameh be'ohel, af tikra b'avodah zara metameh be'ohel. The people joined themselves to Baal Peor, that's a type of idolatry, and they ate offerings to the dead. Why is it called offerings to the dead? They weren't actually worshiping to the dead, sacrifice to the dead. They were giving sacrifice to Baal Peor, that idol, not the dead. So it's giving a comparison that just like a dead body will spread tum'ah anywhere under a tent, so too sacrifices to Avodah Zarah also spread impurity anywhere under a tent. And that's why someone who walks under the tree, they will be under a tent with an idolatrous substance, and therefore they become tameh. The end of the Mishnah said that if the tree is encroaching on a public domain, then if you pass under it, you're tahor. Avad or over? Now we ask, when it says here avad, does it mean o bedi avad? If you passed under it, you're tahor, but that would mean that lechetechila, you're not allowed to pass under it, even though it's a public domain. But don't pass under if under the tree. Or should we read it oved? That if it goes into the public domain, lechatechila, you're allowed to walk there and you'll be tahor. It's a public domain and this tree cannot remove the status of the public domain. You have a permission to walk there. So that's the question. Is it lechatechila or b'di'avad? Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar mishmet Chizkiah amar oved. Rabbi Yochanan amar im avar. There's two opinions. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar says, Oved, you're allowed to walk there, lechatechila, even though you're walking right under the leaves of a tree, public domain, so you're allowed. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, I know it's public domain, but there's a tree here. That's idolatry, so don't walk there. B'di'avad, if you walk there, you're tahor, but you should try not to walk there in the first place. These two Amoraim are not actually arguing. They're rather talking about two different cases. If there is another path that you can go down without going under any Avoda Zara tree, then you should go down that path. And so that would be Rabbi Yochanan, that there's another path. So therefore, don't go under the tree. But the avad, if you did, you're tahor. But you should try not to. Whereas the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, that's talking about a case where there is no other path. There's no other way to get there. So I have to go down this public path. Even though it's under a tree, lechatechila, it's permitted because I have no choice. Now there's a story about Rav Sheshat who would tell his attendant, listen, when we get to that spot there where the road goes under an idolatrous tree, I want you to run with me. I want you to pull me and run fast as possible. We have to go under the tree, but we're going to run. Now what is the case? If there is no other way to pass, there's no other road, then why is he saying run? It's permitted, lechatechila, to walk regular. This is the road, the only road I'm allowed to go. It's permitted. And if there is another path, then he should take the other path. When he says, let's run, is that permitted to run? Lechatechila, one should not go down that path, not walking and not running. So what would be a case where he's allowed to run, but he wouldn't be allowed to walk? In fact, we're talking about a case where there is no other path. And really, it would be permitted to walk. That permission would be for a regular person, could walk because there is no other path. But Rav Sheshat is an important person, and people are going to look to him as an example, and they may not realize that, this is a case where there was no other path, and that's why he's walking. They might just say, look, I guess you're allowed to walk under an idolatrous tree, and they won't make such a distinction. So because he's such an important person, he shouldn't even seem to appear to be walking leisurely under a tree. So even though there's no other path and it's permitted, still he wanted to run as fast as possible. Next Mishnah, Zor'in tachteha yerakot bimot hageshamim aval lo bimot hachama. One is permitted to plant vegetables underneath an Asherah tree in the rainy season, but not in the summer season. The reason is that in the summer season, you need a lot of shade, and the shade of the Asherah tree is going to benefit the vegetables to grow better by being in the shade. But in the rainy season, there's not that much sun, less hours of sun, and it's cloudy and raining, so you don't need that much shade. And therefore, the protection, the shade of the tree is not benefiting the vegetables, and so it's permitted. But if it's lettuce, then one may not plant lettuce under an Asherah tree, not in the winter and not in the summer, because lettuce needs a lot of shade. It needs shade not only in the summer but even in the winter. Rabbi Yosef Omer, Af lo yirakot bimot geshamim mipnei she'aneviyah nosheret alehen vehova lahen lezebel. Rabbi Yosef is much more stringent, and he says one cannot plant any vegetables under an Asherah tree any time of the year, not even in the rainy season, because in the rainy season the leaves fall, and the leaves will be fertilizer. They fall onto the ground and they contribute to the health of the soil and makes the thing grow better. And so therefore one cannot get any benefit at all from the tree, and is totally prohibited. Gemara analyzes this last part. Lememra de Rabbi Yosef sabar ze v'ze gorem asur, v'Rabbanan amre ze v'ze gorem mutar. So can we derive from here that according to Rabbi Yosef, if there are two causes for something, one of the causes is permitted and one cause is prohibited, then we take the prohibited cause. And we see that Rabbi Yosef says so because the vegetables are growing, number one, from the nutrients that are already in the ground, and that's permitted. Number two, from the leaves that are falling, that from an Asherah tree, that are prohibited. Now you have two causes. Which one do we focus on? Well, the prohibited one makes it all prohibited, and you can't plant any vegetables. But according to the Rabbanan, they say they don't care about the leaves falling. How come they don't care about it? It must be that they think that when there are two causes, we don't focus on the negative one and the prohibited one because there's a permitted cause that is giving the vegetables nutrients from the ground already, and therefore zev v'zeh gorem is permitted. So that seems like a good principle to derive from this Mishnah. However, ha'ipecha sham inan lehu. There's a Mishnah earlier in this Masechet on 43b from which we derive the opposite opinions. Titnan, Rabbi Yosef omer shochek v'zoreh laruach o matir layam. Amru lo, af hi na'asa zebel v'ne'emad lo yidbak biyadecha me'uma min ha'cherem. The Mishnah taught that if you want to nullify an idol, one has to grind it up. Rabbi Yosef says, grind it up and throw it into the wind or throw it into the sea. And then that's it, it's gone. But the rabbis said, disagreed. The rabbis here are more stringent. And they said, if you throw it into the wind, it's going to land on the field and that will be fertilizer for the field. And the Pasuk says, one cannot get any benefit at all from something that is prescribed as Avoda Zara. And so we see here that it's the rabbis that say, Ze v'ze gorem is asur. You have this fertilizer that's from the idol that's going on the ground, but plus there's also natural nutrients in the ground that are helping things grow. So it's Ze v'ze gorem, and the rabbis say asur, and Rabbi Yosef is the one that says Ze v'ze gorem is permitted. So what if there's a little bit of fertilizer that's flying onto the field that's from an idol? But there's also natural nutrients. So zev v'zeh gorem is mutar. Kashya Rabbanan ad Rabbanan, Kashya Rabbi Yosef ad Rabbi Yosef. We have a contradiction between the two statements of Rabbanan and a contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Yosef. Bishlama ad Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef la kashya hatam de kazil ibud matir. Hachad de la kazil ibud asur. There's no contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Yosef because there, with when you take an idol and grind it up and throw it into the wind, it's getting lost. It's getting scattered so far. It's just a tiny bit that's going to be scattered over a big, large piece of land. And so basically, it's mostly getting lost. And the contributing factor of that fertilizer to any particular plant is so little, we just basically say that it got lost. Whereas with the leaves, all the leaves are falling down right underneath and going to those very plants right underneath. So it's a significant amount of benefit. It's not getting lost. And that's why the Yosef makes a distinction between the two cases. But we have no way to resolve the contradiction between the two statements of the rabbis. So we say, maybe switch them around. This Mishnah here, this machloket that we saw, maybe the attributions are incorrect. And if you switch them around, then it will reconcile with their earlier Mishnah. That's one way. And that will also reconcile to Yosef. Or leave the Mishnayot the way they are, to Rabbi Yosef kedeshaninan. And the contradiction between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yosef we already explained. The Rabbanan kedamar Rav Mari bered Rav Kahana mashe mashbiach baor pogem babasar hachaname mashe mashbiach beneviyah pogem basel. We can resolve the contradiction between the two statements of the rabbis in a similar way that Rav Mari, the son of Rav Kahana, explains a certain principle. And that is that if you have a korban and you're going to skin the skin of a korban is permitted, even if it's a korban olah, where all of the flesh and insides get burnt, but the skin, the kohanim keep. Now, there's different ways of skinning it. You can skin the animal by cutting the skin and taking it piece by piece. but then the skin is not so valuable because it's not whole. Or you can skin it whole so that the skin is totally together, and then the skin is worth more. However, this is not permitted. You're not allowed to skin a sacrificial animal such that it's whole because of this principle, that which even though it makes the hide more valuable, mashbiach ba'or, but you have to cut the flesh and make the flesh less valuable by doing that. That's part of that process. And so here, because it's a korban, we can't make the flesh less valuable in order to make the skin more valuable. The flesh is sacrificial. The skin is just going to the kohanim. And therefore, you have to weigh the pros and cons of each one, and therefore you can't benefit the hide by damaging the flesh. We're going to use a similar principle here, where we look at the pros and cons. And according to Rabbanan, one is permitted to plant underneath vegetables underneath the foliage in the wintertime, even though the leaves are falling and giving a little bit of fertilizer. But mashe mashbiach beneviyah, the benefit that the leaves are giving as a fertilizer is relatively small, and the damage caused by the shade in the wintertime, you don't want so much shade in the wintertime. You need actually a little bit more sun in the wintertime. And so even though the fertilizer is giving some benefit to the vegetables, but the shade is actually making it worse. So taking the equation altogether, the tree is worse for the vegetables. The benefit is outweighed by the negative of the tree. And so that's why Rabbanan say that even though in general zeh v'zeh gorem, they would say is prohibited. That's what they said in the previous case of the dust from the idol that's thrown. They said it's prohibited. If it's giving a little bit of benefit, that's prohibited. Even though there's another cause, still prohibited. But here, the benefit that the foliage is giving as fertilizer is outweighed by the negative shade, too much shade, that will damage the vegetation, and therefore, all told, the tree is not benefiting the vegetables, and therefore it is permitted. We'll continue on the next stuff with this subject of Zeh V'Zeh Gorem. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.